Hello. Descartes is known for his views about the nature of the mind. In this lecture, I'm going to present his views along with his arguments in support of his views. We first need to situate what Descartes says about the mind in context of the Meditations overall. So recall that Descartes' project in the Meditations is to provide a foundation for the sciences, a foundation for our knowledge about the external world and about other matters. To accomplish this aim, Descartes first establishes his own existence, and what that means is that each of us has knowledge of our own existence that is clear and distinct. And Descartes uses that as a model to think about how we can have other types of knowledge. What that means is that clarity and distinctness in what we perceive is the paradigm for having knowledge with 100% certainty. Descartes supports this clarity and distinctness principle by establishing that God exists. And God's existence guarantees that principle because God wouldn't deceive us about anything because God is perfect. In Meditation 6, Descartes returns to the initial worries about how we can know that the external world exists, as well as how we can know that we're not dreaming, but rather awake. Descartes also explains his own views about the nature of the mind and how it relates to the body. And the main aim there is indicated by the title of the Meditations. Recall that the full title of the Meditations says something about proving the immortality of the soul. And the idea there is that we have a soul that doesn't go out of existence when we die. When our body deteriorates, the soul is untouched, and the soul can keep living. And so when we have that word soul, that's basically equivalent to the word mind for Descartes' purposes. Recall earlier that Descartes in the Meditations says that the soul or the mind is something that essentially is a thinking thing, that he himself is a thinking thing, and that's what his mind does. That's its characteristic activity. We ought to be careful here to distinguish the word mind from the word brain. Brain is the organ that we have that we will say is responsible for thinking, at least from our contemporary perspective. But Descartes doesn't necessarily want to identify the mind with the brain. So the question is, what's responsible for thinking, for consciousness, and various mental acts? And is that really just the brain, as many philosophers today would hold? Or is there something like a spiritual substance, which is what Descartes holds? More fully, there are a variety of views about the nature of the mind. So this is a philosophical subdiscipline, philosophy of mind. We can organize the various views in philosophy of mind as coming under two heads. First, there's dualism, which holds that there are two fundamental kinds of things, mental stuff and physical or material stuff. So that would be Descartes' view. He holds that there's two fundamental kinds of substances, minds or souls, or whatever you want to call it, and then bodies, which is physical stuff made up of matter. The general name for views that oppose dualism is monism. So it comes from the word mono, and so what it means is that there's only one kind of stuff. And this could take two forms, though. Either you emphasize the mental kind of stuff, and that's the view of idealism, which holds that all that exists is mental in some way, and denies the existence of physical things or material things. On the other hand, you have a form of monism which says that the material things are all that exist and deny the mental stuff. Or say that the mental stuff can be explained in terms of material stuff. So within the last 100 years or so, this has been the most predominant view among philosophers. And there are a variety of versions of this materialist view. And I've given on the slide some names of different views here, but it's by no means exhaustive. For our purposes, the main contrast here is between dualism, which Descartes holds, and materialism, which is what most philosophers today would hold. What I'll do now is explain Descartes' reasons for holding his dualist view, which is sometimes called Cartesian dualism. Descartes' first argument for dualism is based on an analysis of what is essential to minds and what is essential to bodies. So he analyzes our concepts and what we're aware of in thinking about minds and thinking about bodies, and he identifies an essential difference between the two. Whereas minds are essentially thinking for Descartes, bodies are essentially non-thinking. So you think rocks out there in the world, they don't ultimately think. Various bits of matter, hydrogen particles, oxygen particles, whatever it is, those things aren't essentially thinking, but minds have to think in order to exist. So that's one difference between minds and bodies, whether they are essentially thinking or not. The other essential difference Descartes points out is whether they are extended or not. What I mean by that term extension and what Descartes means and what philosophers mean is extended in space and extended in time sometimes, but primarily extended in space. So having 3 dimensions in space, length, width, depth, anything made up of matter, that is to say all bodies, on Descartes' understanding of that term body, all those things have extension. They have measurable features in the 3 dimensions of space. Minds, on the other hand, for Descartes, are not extended. What that means is that you can't measure a thought. You can't measure an idea as taking up space. For example, if you have an image in your mind of a tree, now the tree that you're imagining has spatial dimensions, but the image itself, the very idea of the tree, doesn't have spatial dimensions. It merely depicts spatial dimensions, but the idea itself doesn't have spatial dimensions. You can't put a ruler to it and measure its length, width, and depth. So that's Descartes' first argument. Whereas mind is essentially thinking and non-extended, body is essentially non-thinking and extended. Therefore, since they have this essential difference between the two of them, they are 2 different kinds of substances. Descartes' second argument for his dualist view has exactly the same structure. Whereas minds are essentially indivisible, bodies are essentially divisible. Therefore, they're 2 different kinds of substances. So here, this argument relies on the notion of divisibility, about whether you can cut it up into parts. Bodies you can keep cutting up into smaller and smaller bits and parts, going even to the subatomic level, as we learned since Descartes' time. But minds for Descartes are not divisible. And Descartes' support of that point is that minds do not take up space. It's that minds are not extended, as we saw in the previous argument. If something doesn't take up space, then it cannot be cut into different parts. The act of cutting or dividing presupposes space, according to Descartes, presupposes having spatial dimensions. And so this argument really is only a variation on the previous argument. But we get a third and final argument that offers something different, and I think is really Descartes' main argument for his dualism. This argument has quite a few more steps. The first step or premise relies on this idea of clarity and distinctness. Descartes says that if I can clearly and distinctly conceive of something, then God could create such a thing in the manner I conceive it. So this first premise relies on the third meditation's proof of God's existence. God would not deceive us in the things that we perceive clearly and distinctly, because God would not deceive us about things that we cannot help but believe, that is to say, cannot deceive us about things that we clearly and distinctly perceive. The next premise takes this fundamental thought and applies it to our awareness or conception of mind and body. The second premise is that I can clearly and distinctly conceive of my own mind as a thinking thing which is not extended. Notice that this premise only mentions how I conceive of my own mind, how I think of my own mind. It doesn't yet say that my mind is really only a thinking thing and something non-extended. It's rather that this is how I primarily conceive of it. And that's the same with the third premise, which holds that I can clearly and distinctly conceive of my body as a non-thinking thing and as something that is extended. So what we have so far with the first premise is a general principle that we can use to derive further conclusions. And then with the second and third premises, we have specific statements about what we clearly and distinctly conceive. Descartes' argument puts these three premises together to derive his dualism. So the first step is putting the second and third premises together. And if you put those premises together, you get the conclusion that I can clearly and distinctly conceive my mind without my body and my body without my mind. What that means is I can conceive of the possibility that my mind exists and my body doesn't, and that my body might exist without my mind existing. I can conceive of that because if my mind is something that thinks and is not extended, then I'm not required to think of something extended, my body, as something necessary for my mind to exist. They have fundamentally different attributes or properties. They don't need something with different properties to support their existence. We can also use specific examples to support this conclusion. For example, I see bodies out there in the world, whether human bodies or not, that are not thinking. And I also don't apprehend them or conceive of them as thinking. So we can conceive of body existing without mind. But likewise, as we did earlier in the meditations, I might doubt the existence of any external bodies whatsoever. And if I can perform that doubt, if it's possible for me to perform that doubt, then it's possible for me to conceive of my mind as existing without any body supporting it. So with this first conclusion, all we have is a statement about how I can clearly and distinctly perceive or conceive of my mind and body. But if we apply that first principle to this conclusion, we get the result that God could create my mind without my body, and vice versa. If I can clearly and distinctly conceive of my mind existing without my body, and vice versa, then since God is not a deceiver, God could, in principle, create one but not the other. And this thought leads to the ultimate conclusion of the argument, which is that mind and body are really distinct. What Descartes means by really distinct is a little bit tricky, but the basic thought here is that even if mind and body coexist, exist together, they are ultimately different things. And they are ultimately different things because one can exist without the other. And we know that one could exist without the other because we have a clear and distinct perception of one existing without the other. And we can trust our clear and distinct perception of that because God wouldn't deceive us about our clear and distinct perceptions. Now, at this point, you likely have some objections or worries about how Descartes' argument really works. And you're in good company because a lot of people have objected to what Descartes has said about the nature of the mind. Here, I'll just survey some of the initial responses to Descartes' arguments and view of dualism. One objection is that some distinctions are merely logical but not real. So our distinction between mind and body, that's just a mere linguistic or conceptual distinction, but ultimately not a real distinction. An example that can illustrate this idea is our understanding that water is H2O. Water is one concept, H2O is another concept, and that means that there's a logical or conceptual distinction between water and H2O. But as we know, water and H2O are really the same thing. So what this means is that there's not a real distinction between the two. And so we might wonder whether mind and body, those are just two different concepts. There's just a logical distinction between them, but not a real distinction, because body might explain how the mind works. A second objection is to why Descartes is trying to establish this stuff about mind and body. As Descartes says, he wants to establish the immortality of the soul, but none of the arguments in the Meditations directly show that. They at most show that mind and body are distinct things, and that leaves open the possibility that mind or soul could exist without body. But that does not suffice to establish that minds continue to exist for eternity. Another objection is similar in focusing on religious or theological consequences. And this is that Descartes' account of how the mind is completely different from body, that account does not accord with the Christian idea of original sin. This doctrine of original sin holds that we sin due to temptation, and we have temptations as a result of having bodies. And so what that means is that the doctrine of original sin attributes sin to us in virtue of having bodies. But Descartes' view says that what we essentially are is not a body at all, and that what we essentially are just souls. And so the problem is how we can say that a soul is responsible for sin. Alternatively, why care about what the body does? Why make the soul responsible for sinning when it's just the body? Now, the most important objection to Descartes is that he doesn't have a good account of how the mind and the body can interact with one another. For example, how can changes in my body, such as an injury, lead to changes in my mind, such as having pain as a result of the injury? It seems that Descartes has a problem accounting for this sort of thing because he holds that bodies are essentially extended, whereas minds are essentially non-extended. And what that means is that bodies affect one another by pushing up against each other or by colliding with one another. But the mind, if it lacks any spatial dimensions whatsoever, it cannot be pushed by other things. It doesn't collide with other things. It doesn't interact with things that are material because it is essentially different. And so it seems that Descartes lacks a good account of what happens in ordinary life. In a coming lecture, we'll return to this objection or worry with Descartes' view, where we'll see how Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia raises a similar worry in her correspondence with Descartes, and we'll see how Descartes responds.